Morning, everyone, and welcome to our webinar. I am joined by Joshua Williams here. So today we're going to talk about the EPBD and how you can build your roadmap for 2050. Maybe before we start, Josh, a quick question. Why is the EPBD important in one sentence?
Well, it's going to change the energy compliance landscape for real estate developers into the coming 25 years. So it's fairly important to understand your risks.
Indeed. So the landscape is changing, and let's understand it. So this webinar is in the lead up to an event that us on Solarplaza are organizing. It's called Net Zero Buildings. And yeah, the reason why we're going to do this is what we explained in the webinar, but also that we have goals and deadlines to meet, and the industry is, running behind. So we hope that this event will bring us forward. It will happen on the 20th of November in Rotterdam, and we hope that you can join us. So what will this webinar cover? So this is a quick introduction by me. I'm Dee from Solarplaza, and then we will cut to a presentation from Josh, and then we have time for general Q&As. So who are we at Solarplaza? Well, we organize events for the past 20 years because we believe that the sun is the solution. Our goal and passion is really to push the energy transition. And as you can see, we have a platform to share knowledge and network, but we also do that in events, like the event that we will be doing in the 20th of November. Cool. And if you have any questions, you will see on your screen on the top right, there is a box with a question mark. If you have any questions, start posting them there. We will collect them, and Josh will get to them at the end of the at the end of his presentation. If you are struggling with any technical issues, use the chat box as well to let us know. We have a great AV support here, Margaret, who will get back to you. All right, then without any ado, I would like to give the floor then to a consultant on the climate and decarbonization spectrum from BDO. Joshua Williams, you have the floor and the mic control as well. The mouse control, apologies.
Great.
You should be receiving that any moment.
Yeah, I see the prompt. Thank you very much.
Of course, floor is yours.
Great. Well, thank you to everyone in attendance, and thank you also, of course, to Solarplaza for hosting this webinar today and giving me the chance to share how we approach the EPBD from BDO's perspective. And I hope we can share some insights with you and also some practical ways forward that you can also implement into 2026 and beyond as the EPBD takes effect. As Dee mentioned, we will be attendance, and I will also be a keynote speaker at the summit happening in Rotterdam next month. I hope to see as many of you there as possible, where we will further unpack this and also have an opportunity to collaborate in person, which is always great. All right, so to start, a little bit of an overview of the presentation. I will give a quick introduction to who we are at BDO, the Climate and Decarbonization team, specifically where we sit and what we do. Before we get into the real meat of the presentation, I will set the scene a little bit with the net zero context, kind of where the EPBD originates from and why the EU is prioritizing this into the next 25 years. And then we will unpack that directive, looking at what it's trying to achieve, the measures that it's going to be implementing to achieve those goals, and how that at the end of the day will affect your entities as organizations that exist within real estate, construction, and buildings. I'll close off with a final section on financial incentives. I think this is quite useful and another opportunity for you to turn this kind of compliance trigger into some opportunities for your business. So we will share some of those possible financial incentives for sustainable buildings. All right, to get started, who we are, BDO. You've probably heard of the company before. when people think of BDO, they usually think of audit and assurance. Of course, that's where we started. We are foundational in that aspect, and so we've been building on that and building around that for quite some time. Of course, we do advisory as well, and now within that advisory, we also have a sustainability advisory team. We focus sort of on 3 key pillars, playing to our audit and assurance strengths. Of course, one of those is reporting and compliance. So reporting and compliance services related to anything to do with sustainability or ESG data. Of course, we provide these services on the financial side, but now also moving over to the ESG side as it becomes more mature over time, focusing on things like CSRD and other current laws and regulations within the space. We then also focus heavily on impact. That's mostly at transformation and risk, trying to embed strategic sustainability within organizations and connecting real impact, real societal impact with, of course, economic value for the entities. And then where my team sits, which also sort of goes across these other 2 pillars, is climate and decarbonization. That's really one of the biggest focus areas of ESG, especially as we work towards our shared global goals of the Paris Agreement, which I will also unpack in a moment. What I want to mention is real estate is also one of our focus areas. So not only within the climate and decarbonization team, where we have a lot of expertise within real estate and we service a lot of real estate related clients, we have complementary services that go with these climate services that we offer. Things like grants and subsidies. That's actually where the financial incentives section will come in right at the end. We also have a real estate valuation service. And of course, we've got legal teams specifically looking at ESG legal obligations. All right. Who we are in the literal sense. Of course, I'm one part of a team, a climate and decarbonization team. We focus more on myself particularly is on regulatory pressure. Things like CBAM, that's the carbon border adjustment mechanism. It's important for construction companies if they're importing a lot of cement, for example, from other regions in the world. Of course, CSRD, as I mentioned, other regulatory instruments that you can comply with. A bit about our background as a team. We are sort of cross-sectional, multidisciplinary with assurance experts, engineering experts, business experts, law experts. My personal background is in chemical engineering, so I really like to work in the details of these kinds of mechanisms and instruments in terms of doing the calculations and really how the nitty-gritty of reporting under these various instruments. We have a number of services. I won't spend too much time on this, but we kind of across the climate scope from GHG accounting or carbon accounting, risk assessments, that's kind of more your foundational climate services, but we also do target setting, reduction strategies. Reduction strategies is maybe more important for our topic today, as well as transition plans. So how do you transition from where you are today as your baseline to getting to where you need to be? Some additional things like I mentioned before, CBAM support and other compliance instruments support, EU Taxonomy, for example, and other legal types of advisory as it relates to ESG law and ESG compliance. All right, so enough about us. Why we're all here today is really to unpack the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. I wanted to start because you can't really start talking about it without understanding the broader context. And that broader context is the net zero context. When we start unpacking the directive itself and you see that carbon neutral and net zero starts cropping up, it's important to understand why these terms are important today and where they come from. So to start, of course, maybe some of you are already familiar with the Paris Agreement. That is the legally binding climate treaty, I think, signed by over 190 countries across the world. The main goal of the climate treaty, the Paris Agreement, is to hold the increase in global average temperatures to well below 2 degrees Celsius, above pre-industrial levels, but at the same time pursuing efforts as strongly as possible, aggressively as possible, to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And that small distinction is important because really the effects of climate change get much more dramatic once you cross that 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold. So that's what globally countries around the world are trying to achieve. Within that context, the European Union as a bloc is one of the leaders within the climate action space. They have some of the most ambitious targets when it comes to emission reductions, and they tend to be a leader in terms of policy, climate policy, and energy policy. For example, the policy we're going to be looking at today, or the directive that we're going to be looking at today. So in the context of the Paris Agreement, the EU aims to be climate neutral by 2050. And what that means for them is essentially an economy with net zero greenhouse gas emissions. Now, 2050 is a date that you will see come up also quite frequently. If you have any experience with setting climate reduction targets, emission reduction targets, you might be familiar with the entity known as the Science-Based Targets Initiative. That's the non-profit organization that sort of validates targets of companies across the world. Those targets, those science-based targets, are aligned with climate science, and what the science says is that by 2050, we need to be net zero in order to try and achieve some of these global temperature increases or limit these global temperature increases that we have mentioned in the Paris Agreement. So 2050 net zero is the ultimate goal. They often go hand in hand. Some countries and some organizations are trying to get there before 2050. In the context of the EU, 2050 is what they're aiming for. And maybe important to unpack a little bit about what net zero means in general. So net zero is the state where our emissions, the emissions by human-induced activity, are balanced out by removal from the atmosphere. So essentially, the net effect is zero emissions. That doesn't mean that there are no emissions happening. It just means that the emissions that are happening, because there are some sectors where emission reduction is extremely hard to abate, those are being compensated by some types of removal activities happening elsewhere around the world. Okay, so now that we understand net zero, why is this relevant to real estate, construction, and buildings? And why do we talk about energy oftentimes when we're talking about emission reduction, really, in another way? And that's because the link between energy and emissions is extremely strong, and they tend to go hand in hand with one another. Now, of course, that is because energy historically has been produced from different types of fossil sources, and some stats that are informing the types of directives and policies that the EU is pursuing, I've shared with you in this slide. So to start with, buildings are responsible for around 40% of the energy consumed in the EU. Of course, if that energy is coming from a mixture of sources, a lot of them fossil sources, that's going to have a large influence on the emissions and the emission reduction opportunities that the EU can pursue. On top of that, 85% of the buildings in the EU were built before the year 2000, and basically 3/4 of that have poor energy performance. So a lot of older buildings, buildings that are 20, 25 years and older, and the large majority of those buildings have really poor energy performance. And even though those stats are apparent, and there are types of incentives out there for new buildings and building renovations, currently the energy renovation rate remains very low at about roughly 1%. And essentially the energy renovation rate is just the rate at which buildings are being renovated to improve their energy performance. So that's the energy perspective, which remains the key perspective for the context of our discussion today. But it's important to know that the reason energy is being tackled is because energy and emissions go hand in hand. And you can see that in the couple of stats that I've put right at the bottom of the screen on the left, and that's emissions from buildings. and over 1/3 of the EU's energy-related emissions come from buildings, and that's because mostly the heating, the cooling, and the supply of hot water, essentially. Natural gas is still used quite widely, quite commonly. Of course, that has a emissions impact when natural gas is burnt in order to supply heat for buildings and for heating of water. And so the way that the union is going to tackle emissions is from that energy perspective, looking at ways that we can incentivize and make opportunities for real estate developers and existing buildings to be renovated to improve the energy usage. Okay, so we understand a little bit of the context, why the EU is looking at energy specifically in their buildings and how that relates to its wider ambitions to be net zero by 2050. Now we can start to unpack the EPBD, the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. 2026 and beyond, 2026 is when it will start coming into effect, when countries are going to have to start implementing it at a national level. Of course, it remains a directive for the Union at this point, but individual countries will need to start implementing their own versions of it by following that directive. So a little bit of the approach of what the EU is trying to achieve when looking at the energy performance of buildings directive. From their perspective, yes, it does tackle emissions as a sort of final outcome or as a headline outcome, but there are other types of co-benefits that you will get across society from improving the energy performance of buildings. To set the scene a little bit, when we're talking about energy performance of buildings, usually we're looking at things like the building envelope. So that is typically insulation and windows. So the areas of your building that are interacting with the outside elements, of course, that is usually your insulation and windows. You also have the efficiency of building systems. So as I already alluded to before, in particular, and the aspects of buildings that account for most of the energy consumption are heating, cooling, and hot water. And then also the use of renewable energy, for example, via solar panels that are installed on buildings. So these are the focus areas when we're talking about energy performance and energy efficiency of a building. Now, from the EU's perspective, they believe that improving energy performance will, of course, save energy, number one, by improving energy efficiency, right? That means you need to use less energy. That in turn means less energy is required, which also improves energy independence and energy security. We've seen in the past issues where the EU has been dependent on energy sources from outside of the bloc, and the kinds of issues that can bring, both economically for the people who need to pay for this energy, but also politically in terms of the ties that need to be kept with other countries in order to supply this energy. So energy independence and energy security is a major trigger, also a co-benefit of the European Union's strategy. Of course, how that influences the end user or the people living, renting, paying for the bills, lower energy bills, and then also a reduced investment need for grid infrastructure. So if there's less reliance on the grid or less demand from the grid, it also means you don't need to invest as much to keep the grid maintained and to grow it. So this directive is looking to help the EU achieve their energy efficiency goal, which is reducing energy consumption by almost 12% by 2030 from its current projected value. And also what they want to do is also stimulate the rollout of renewables in buildings. So what you'll see when we get into the actual directive itself is they're trying to incentivize opportunities and basically compliance mechanisms that will allow buildings to be built with solar already as a provision on the building. Last but not least, there's the social impact or the societal impact, and buildings with better energy performance create healthier living conditions, of course, more stable temperatures within buildings, more sustainable buildings, and at the end of the day should also be more affordable in the long run. Of course, there will be upfront investments that need to be made, but these will be more affordable in the long run. So that's a little bit of the EU strategy. Now we get into the directive itself. To summarize this, we actually have quite a lovely article that was authored by one of the other members of our C&D, Climate and Decarbonization team, Michaela. If you guys want to read a little bit of the detail, I would recommend you go and find the article she published. It's on the BDO website. You should be able to find it there, or if you just do a quick Google of the energy performance of buildings directives, it will pop up. In summary, the EPBD, it requires member states to improve the energy performance of buildings. It does that in a number of ways and using a number of mechanisms. First things first, it mandates energy performance certificates and introduces minimum energy performance standards. So what will happen is these member states, the individual countries, will have to introduce new standards that even existing buildings will need to comply with in terms of minimum energy performance. There's already standards out there in terms of new builds, of course, but what has been lacking in the legislation to this point is standards for existing buildings. So it will essentially force the worst performing energy buildings to start undergoing renovations and retrofits. There will also be sort of going in hand with the point I just mentioned, mandatory retrofit costs on the horizon. So if you have a poor energy rating, if you've got some of the poorest energy ratings, it will be mandated that you have to invest a certain minimum amount to upgrade them, and owners and valuers will need to start pricing them into valuations as well. There's a couple of milestones on the horizon. 2030 is the one closest to us. That's for new buildings. So the directive mentions that all new buildings will need to be zero emissions, whereas by 2050, all buildings will need to be zero emissions. So that's maybe the major single goal. If you had to boil the EPBD down to one goal, one headline, the European Union, they would say that by 2050, they want their building stock to be zero emissions, basically. So all the buildings within the Union in totality are zero emissions. And this is one of the mechanisms that they're attempting to use to get to that point. Now, they're going to attempt to achieve this through 4 focus areas. I will go through each of these focus areas, each of these 4 focus areas now. These will be important to contextualize actually how you will need to approach your renovations if you are going to need to do renovations, or the standard that you will want to follow if you're building new buildings. And the first of these 4, maybe the biggest of these 4, is renovation. Of course, the existing building stock is going to be responsible for still the most or the significant amount of buildings that will be in the Union by 2050. And of course, that means that a lot of these existing buildings are going to need to be renovated. It's much easier and a much easier sell to set standards for new builds, which is included in this package. But sometimes the trickiest thing is to assess how you can attack the existing building stock out there, and that's going to be through renovation, essentially. So these things will vary from member state to member state, which is important to note, but there are guiding regulations or guiding principles within the directive that each member state will have to achieve in their own way. How they necessarily get to that point is going to be up to them. So it will be interesting to see how things shake out next year in 2026, when some of these mandates will be published at the member state level. So to kick off on renovation, each EU country will have to develop its own national building renovation plan. So each country will have their own national strategy to renovate buildings, to decarbonize the existing building stock, and also making provision for areas such as financing. So when we look at the end of the slideshow, when we get to the financing incentives or the financial opportunities, you'll notice a lot of them actually don't run too far into the future, and that's because the expectation is with this EPBD, there will be a new batch of financial incentives that will have to come into place to enable these different types of renovations that will need to be done for the existing building stock. It will also then introduce minimum energy performance standards. So this triggers renovation of the 16% worst performing buildings. So basically the bottom 16% of energy performers by 2030, they will be triggered for renovation. And the idea is that by 2033, it will be the bottom 26%. So over a quarter, essentially, of the existing building stock will need to be renovated by 2033, starting with your worst energy performers and working your way from there. Now, there are some specifics for residential building stock. And again, these are going to be adopted country by country. But the idea is to reduce the average energy use of residential buildings by 16% by 2030, and by 2035, 20 to 22%. How each, again, member state achieves that, they're going to have to come up with their own national trajectories and national strategies. So that tackles the first focus area of the EPBD. Maybe the one that has really the most tangible impact on the decisions that renovators and those organizations who have a large existing stock will have to take into account. But of course, there will be additional implications for new builds. The second focus area, decarbonization. This is, again, as I mentioned before, energy and emissions going hand in hand. So you can kind of see how that's playing out in the second focus area of this directive. Although it's called an energy directive, a focus area is decarbonization at the end of the day. So the revised directive makes zero emission buildings the standard for new buildings, essentially. So that comes back to what I mentioned in the summary on the previous slide. Essentially, by 2030, all new buildings will need to be zero emission buildings. So they will have to have no net emissions in terms of their use. Countries will also have to ensure that these new buildings are solar ready. So new buildings will need to essentially be designed in such a way that they are fit to host solar systems, whether that's photovoltaic systems, so essentially these panels that harvest solar energy, or whether it's solar thermal installations. You get these other versions of solar systems that are there specifically for the purpose of heating water, for example. So new builds are going to have these solar ready sort of designs, so that it's always easy and accessible to install solar systems on these new builds. In terms of boilers, there have been some incentives in the past. I think they finished in 2021, sorry, on 1 January 2025. And that's on the fossil fuel use in boilers. So essentially, boilers powered by fossil fuels, they will be gradually phased out, starting with the end of financial incentives for standalone boilers, as I mentioned before. And these will now be moved likely to electric boilers. The last aspect of decarbonization, and maybe the most technically challenging aspect, will be the life cycle carbon emissions of new buildings. So there will be differences in new builds in terms of the carbon footprint of the construction phase, of course. Now, how that's normally referenced, or how that's normally thought of, is what is called embodied emissions, or embodied carbon. Essentially, that is the carbon that is due to the production of these materials that go into buildings. So, for example, if you're using certain types of bricks or certain types of steel, those input materials will have different carbon footprints associated with their production. And it's the idea that there will be incentives or consideration given to how new builds try to limit as much as possible the embodied carbon in the materials that are used in the building phase. That one will still be developed. There's at this point in time no strict obligations or definitions in terms of how that's going to be considered. So it will be interesting to see exactly what that looks like. And it's also quite technical in terms of the life cycle calculations that you will need to do to consider embodied carbon in your building materials, which will be interesting from a climate technical perspective to keep an eye on. Right, there are still two further focus areas. These are modernization and digitalization, and then the sort of financing and technical assistance aspect. In terms of the modernization and digitalization, this can be thought of as sustainable mobility. That's one of the biggest sort of keys for this particular focus area. So new builds will need to be, sustainable mobility will need to be boosted in new builds through recharging points for EVs and also dedicated bicycle parking spaces. Recharging points, for example, will also have to enable smart charging. So this is now bringing buildings into the current day, where at the moment it's not so accessible. Certainly in some places it's better than others, but it's not always accessible for the enablement of sustainable mobility via charging ports. And the directive is looking to tackle that by this modernization focus area. They're also looking for improvements in the energy performance of a building through greater digitalization. So essentially that's looking at automating the energy control systems in non-residential buildings. What that does, by relying less on manual input and more on automation, you tend to be able to get more stable energy usage and demand in a building, and more consistent and lower energy usage. A good example is the automation of temperature control in a building. Instead of manual inputs, which tend to fluctuate quite dramatically, you can keep that more stable with smarter solutions or smart meters, or more automation in temperature control, and that actually has an influence on the energy used in that building. Final point on digitalization is that the intention is also for energy performance certificates to become digital, which is currently not the norm. Finally, on financing and technical assistance, the directive also ensures targeted financing for investments. So again, we will talk a little bit about financing towards the end of this presentation, but the idea is that the directive should provide more targeted financing for investments in buildings. There's also the social aspect of this, which is fighting energy poverty, essentially. So making sure that those of us most vulnerable, the most vulnerable groups in society, are still able to get good energy, and thus fight energy poverty, which can still be a problem in certain areas within the union. The last one is one-stop shops on technical assistance provided to building owners. Actually, if you visit the Commission website, they are already starting to provide some materials and additional supplementary documents and manuals and guidelines that give you some technical assistance in adding to your toolkit to see how you can tackle the compliance with this EPBD. All right, so those are the sort of focus areas for the EPBD. One thing that's maybe good to mention before we move on to how to transition is who will need to be sort of compliant. So how do you know if it's likely that you will need to be someone affected by this EPBD, especially in the early phases? The easiest way is looking at what the energy performance of your portfolio is, or what the energy performance of your buildings are at the moment. And if you find yourself really at that lower end of energy performance, which will leave you in that bottom 16% of buildings across the stock, it's very likely that you will be included within the first phase in terms of the obligations to renovate and comply with this energy directive. Now, the question then is, how do we transition? How do we react? What can we do about this? We like to provide our clients with a framework to approach the EPBD. Essentially, that's a transition framework. It can be used in many different contexts. Also, when looking at, for example, climate transition plans, making your buildings more climate resilient, for example, or trying to meet reduction targets. But what it does, the framework takes the baseline of where you are today, the end goal of where you'd like to be by 2050 in this case, or maybe 2040 if you're more ambitious, and it helps you determine how you're going to go along that journey and what are the actions that you need to take. So you can summarize this transition approach in sort of 5 different phases. The first of them being the aspire phase, or the ambition phase. That's really just about aligning internally within your organization about what you are trying to achieve. In this case, it would be compliance with the EPBD, or maybe you even want to go one step further and use the trigger of the EPBD to actually completely transform the existing buildings within your stock, and maybe even take the next step to future-proofing yourself. So that involves setting your ambition, being clear about your definition of your goal, and then gathering the necessary expertise. Those expertise can be within your organization. Of course, they can be about getting the right expertise externally. The second phase is the analysis phase. This is basically getting that analytical foundation that you're going to use to inform your decision-making going forward. What we always recommend is doing a gap assessment up front. So that gap assessment kind of will look at the remaining elements of the journey and see what do we already have in place, what do we need to focus on, what are the higher priority items. For example, some of these things maybe you've already done. Maybe you already have energy efficiency targets for your building portfolio, for example. Maybe you already have a financial planning aspect done. Then these are some things you don't have to do. You just have to integrate it into your overall transition strategy. That gap assessment, once completed, will obviously inform the rest of the steps you need to take. Something that's critical is, of course, understanding what your baseline is in terms of energy performance and emissions performance. So quantifying and verifying the current emissions and energy performance of your buildings, and then comparing that with the compliance requirements that you're going to see in the next couple of years rolled out. So once you've done that analytical framework, of course, you need to think about alignment. So aligning with internal and external stakeholders. On the EPBD ambition, there might be other people within the organization that you need to bring along on this journey, even just for things like reporting and monitoring of performance. Maybe there's external stakeholders that you need to contact in terms of investments that will need to be made to transform or renovate your buildings. That's sort of the next step. Then in terms of the value chain, it's kind of related to external stakeholders, but of course the value chain is upstream and downstream of your entity. What are the material issues that you need to tackle? If you need to install charging infrastructure, or you need to procure more sustainable steel for your buildings, are those options available from your current suppliers? Do you need to attempt to find new suppliers? That's the alignment phase. It's really getting everyone on the same page. The next step is then act. So once you've done the analytical foundation, you've managed to get everyone aligned in how you're going to proceed, of course, then the rubber hits the road, right? And you've got to start acting. Of course, that starts with setting a target. If you haven't already done that, what we will actually share in the next couple of slides is some analysis that we've done on different real estate players within the market. I think the 15 biggest ones on the continent, and seeing what we can learn from how those entities are operating. A lot of them do have targets, specifically for energy performance in terms of, kilowatt hours per square meter, for example, is an indicator that's oftentimes used. And they've got targets built around that indicator. Once you've got your targets, it's about prioritizing your measures, so your emission reduction measures or your energy efficiency measures. That will then help you enable your transition strategy, essentially. So we're going to attempt to do A, B, and C in phase one because that's the low-hanging fruit, and it gives us the biggest bang for our buck. And then maybe post 2030 or 2040, you start looking at some of the harder to abate or harder to manage sections of your energy footprint. The financial planning, of course, is always going to be there. You're always going to need capital requirements. You're always going to need to have a good idea of the financial incentives that exist. And of course, then you're going to embed these in your governance structure. So that's mostly just defining accountability and responsibility. At the end of this, you can always disclose this plan. So if you've got a transition plan, you can disclose this. There are some examples out there of real estate funds that have transition plans for their portfolio, for example, and they're looking at how we're going to take our portfolio that is currently not great at energy performance into one of the market leaders. So there are examples which you can also find out there of how different real estate companies have disclosed this plan and what actions they're going to take. I mentioned that real estate was a focus sector for us at BDO. So I wanted to share a couple of slides just on some analysis that we've done and some trends that we've managed to find within the sector. What we did, the methodology that we followed for this was this particular analysis we've done. You can also find this information in the articles published on our website. We really wanted to get a feel for what the maturity was of climate action and climate reporting within the biggest real estate funds throughout the continent. So going through sustainability reports, websites, publicly available and publicly disclosed information, we were able to gather insights on a number of these different sort of levers or pillars in terms of climate disclosure and climate reporting and climate action. And we gave these qualitative scores for each. Some interesting things that we learned. What you will see on the chart on the right-hand side is the real estate funds perform pretty well across the board, but some areas are doing very well and others still need a little bit of focus. One area that needs a little bit of focus is actually the transition planning and resilience. So a lot of your leaders will have really good and really thoroughly disclosed transition plans for their portfolio and what they're going to be doing over the next 10 or 15 years in terms of energy and emission reduction. But it is more of a gap across the sector. Whereas when you look at how decarbonization and energy is integrated into their overall strategy, actually that is something that the biggest funds out there have all integrated into their strategy. So it does show that although there are certainly laggers within the industry, a lot of the market leaders are trying to get in front of some of the compliance obligations that will be coming down the line, as exemplified with this energy performance of buildings directive. So a couple of the takeaways. Governance is very well established when it comes to your energy management and climate reporting at these various entities within the real estate sector. A big thing for the real estate sector, of course, even before it was compliance driven, was always energy, because it's something that has direct costs, and it's one of the obvious areas where improvements made influence the financial health of the buildings, and also ensure that the buildings will be able to be sustainably managed over time. So energy use is consistently tracked, and the great thing when looking at the decarbonization focus area, for example, is that energy use and emissions, as I mentioned before, they do go hand in hand. So these tend to be metrics that real estate companies already know very well. They already know what their energy use per square meter is, what the energy ratings are, and where improvements need to be made in terms of retrofitting heating systems or installing solar on their buildings, etc. Climate strategy, as I mentioned, it's integrated. It is also growing, but some gaps still exist. Two of the biggest ones we picked up was scenario analysis. So how different types of scenarios are going to affect the outcome of the real estate companies, and also actually having targets that are science-based and aligned with the overall net zero 2050 goals. Those still tend to be quite rare. All right. So that's the overview of the EPBD. Of course, I will be taking some questions at the end of it. And if you ever have any more questions, you're welcome to reach out to myself or my team, and we can assist you with that. I wanted to finish with some examples on financial incentives for sustainable buildings. I think this is where it gets really interesting in terms of prioritizing the type of actions that you can take and how those actions are incentivized through existing financing mechanisms. So to start with, the good news is that there are incentives available. They in the real estate, in the building sector, they are actually quite plentiful, because it has been something that's been on the agenda for a while already. These incentives are usually focused on sustainability in different forms. For example, charging infrastructure, energy efficiency of real estate. So that's kind of the Energy Performance Directive in a nutshell. Energy efficiency, really. Sustainable building materials, that reflects a little bit on the embodied carbon of the materials that I spoke about earlier, and also the circularity of your building materials. So whether these building materials, when they reach their end of life phase, can be used again and transformed and restored, and continue to be used indefinitely. So these incentives tend to be focused on sustainability, but they also focus tangentially on some of the other focus areas of the EPBD. For example, digitalization, as I mentioned, so installing smart systems within your buildings, and other types of innovation. They can be region specific. So a lot of the incentives are region specific. The ones that I will show you now, of course, are all within the context of the Netherlands, but there are different incentives available in different countries. They can be specific to region type, to type of organization. So whether you're a fund, whether you're focused on social housing, for example, whether you're focused on commercial real estate. They can also be for VBEs, or essentially housing associations, also have specific incentives available for them. What I would note is that as I move on to showing you some examples of incentives, of course, it's not that all of these incentives will apply to your particular case, but our real estate and subsidies team, they do have a quick scan that you can do. So essentially, you provide some information about your building or about your portfolio or your real estate company, and that information that you provide, they will compare against the long list of various incentives available and see if you're a good match for some of the financial incentives that exist at the moment. These are a couple of incentives. I'll start by looking at maybe one or two just to give you a flavor of what is out there. The first one, looking at particularly home renovations. So That's about energy saving measures, installing sustainable heat options, and this is intended mostly for business landlords and institutional investors and private landlords, not necessarily for housing corporations. You can get roughly 10,000 euros or 15,000 euros per home, depending on specifically what action you're undertaking. If you look at something a little sort of bigger in size than that, you can go right to the bottom of the table. You've got options for social real estate. That's things like schools, government buildings, healthcare institutions, even national monuments, for example, or museums. If you're making those more sustainable, you can get, anywhere from 5 million to 1.5 million euros, depending, of course, on the size of your project, the costs of that project, and the impact that the sustainable developments you're going to do are actually going to have. A lot of these, you will see the dates are only a couple of years into the future. It's likely that there will be provided new budget as the years roll by. And as I mentioned before, it's also likely that with the implementation of the EPBD in 2026, that there will be new incentives also coming further down the line to help these organizations that are going to need to do renovations and implement things on their buildings. So I think that brings us to the end. I'm looking at the time. I still want to take or have some time for some questions. So yeah, please feel free to share. Dee, maybe you can jump in and let me know if there are any questions.
Yes, indeed. Thanks, Josh, for the presentation and the clear roadmap. So we have time for 1 or 2 questions. If anyone wants to upload them in the question box on the top right, please, we will answer them, and I will get us started. So yeah, Josh, you presented this clear roadmap. What are people here, if they've not even considered it, what are the first steps they should do? Like the very first thing.
The very first steps, I would say, we would usually recommend the gap assessment. So what you will find is, depending on, of course, what your ambition is, sometimes, and it's very common, that's why these kinds of rules exist, that your ambition is just to be compliance focused, right? So if your ambition is just compliance focused, it's about getting the compliance requirements, comparing them then to what you already have in place, or what your existing state looks like today, and identifying the gaps. From that point, once you know what the gaps are, you can then start to address them and try to prioritize the ones that are maybe more glaring, and the ones that are potentially easier to fill.
Okay, so look at where you are now and then compare it against where you need to be. It's the first ever step. Nice, that's really clear. I also have a question. If you go back to the slides about the different subsidies.
Yes.
Yeah, I was curious here if you've had any experiences to help clients apply for them, or have you had any stories? How has the process been? Maybe some insights there could be useful for the attendees.
Yes, of course. So we have a team specifically in our one of our complementary teams, so not in the climate and decarbonization team itself, but one of the teams we work alongside, my colleague Colin. They are specifically focused on subsidies and green incentives, not necessarily only for real estate, but for all different types of sectors and projects. They've had some success. I know Colin historically has had a lot of success in getting successful applications through and getting these projects really quite well funded and well incentivized. I think some learnings from them that I've always heard is it is quite technical with a lot of these subsidies. So there's usually a very long list of qualifying criteria, right? And it can be quite daunting to go through that list of criteria and try and see whether you meet them all, and maybe you don't even have all the information available to know whether you meet the criteria. But that process and the application process, they can usually be quite heavy, because also there's a lot of checks and controls in place to make sure that these incentives are awarded to worthy projects. So I would say that it's definitely worth your while to explore it, but be prepared that it can take quite a lot just from an admin documentation side. But if you get that successful outcome at the end of it, it really makes a huge difference in getting the types of projects that you want to do through the pipeline.
Okay, thanks, Josh. We do have a question, but I think it's more practical. So it's from Mikhail. They asked if they could have a copy of the presentation. Now, I can say that we share the recordings after, but not the copy. So, Josh, is it okay to say that people can be in contact with you and you can share it with them if they would like the hard copy?
Exactly. I would recommend just reach out to me. You can find me on LinkedIn or on the website, or my email is my name, joshua.williams@bdo.nl. Shoot me an email and I'll be able to share them quite easily across there.
Okay, that's great. Then with that, I will close the questions. And I want to quickly take some time to thank you, Josh, for joining us. And this was the Q&A. Yes, thanks, Ralph. I saw. And then I wanted to share that we have, so for the event, we were able to get some discounts. So thank you for joining the webinar. And as we are merging into the real estate world, we want to say that if you are a real estate, if you represent the real estate side of things, and you're a first-time attendee of Solarplaza, we have a special ticket price and also a discount available for only people who attend this webinar. You will get it in your email, and there I think you have a deadline of a week. So that is something really cool, and we wish to invite you all to the event where you will see me and Josh, of course, that we get to learn all about it. We also do other events if you're interested. We have Greece, we have energy storage in Germany. Here are some discounts that you can look at depending on where we are in the ticket phase. And last but not least, this is the webinar. So thank you very much, Josh from BDO, and we wish everyone a good afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Cheers.
Bye, Josh. Thank you so much.